Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Thomas H. Johnson volume, and we are looking now at poem 657, I Dwell in Possibility. Now, this is such a compelling poem for us. You'll remember in our study of 655, without this there is not, and we said that if the antecedent to the pronoun this is poetic muse, poetic inspiration, she says, without it, I don't have any reason to live. Here in this poem, she's going to make observations about the power of poetry, possibility, over prose. In other words, everything else. Here we will find Emily the poet making one of the most profound statements about the importance of poetry in a classic text of architecture. Yes, I dwell, as in I live, in possibility, a house that she will construct that we will call her poetic house. Now, there's so many different places that we could begin. Do you guys remember 2:14 when we did it together? I taste a liquor never brewed from tankers scooped in pearl. Not all the vats upon the Rhine yield such an alcohol. Inebriate of air am I, and debauchee of dew, reeling through endless summer days from inns of molten blue, when landlords turn the drunken bee out of the foxglove's door, when butterflies renounce their drams, I shall but drink the more, till seraphs swing their snowy hats and saints to windows run to see the little tripler leaning against the sun. Do you guys remember when we did 613? They shut me up in prose, as when a little girl they put me in the closet because they liked me still. Could themselves have peeped and seen my brain go round, they might as wise have lodged a bird for treason in the pound. Himself has but to will, and easy as a star abolishes captivity, and laugh, no more have I. Now, we are in many ways back to earlier poems of statements about poetry and the power of poetry over prose, and we will finish, in fact, with Czesław Miłosz's classic treatise on poetry, where he makes a similar argument to the one that's being made here. Of course, Miłosz, the great Polish poet and beloved in Room 303 for any number of reasons, was as well a great lover of Emily and especially of this poem. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily's our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments where we talked about Emily, who never was sure that she was a poet or was going to be a poet, and of course never intentionally published any of the 11 poems published during her lifetime. She had no idea, guys, that today she would be considered easily one of the 5 most important poets who ever wrote poetry. Amazing, right? I'm also hopeful that you've worked through the previous 656 poems. We just finished with 656. The name of it is Autumn. And if you have, you'll be able to hear echoes in this poem to much of the earlier reading. Now, there is an interesting argument here that from a very young age, Emily was in tension with her father. Now, there's a whole debate about the relationship Emily had with her daddy, and the fact that Emily was never married, and her father apparently didn't seem to pursue much interest in the project, and that he allowed Emily to live in his house for all of her life, which she did, and the fact that he, planted his garden for her and some of those other things has led all kinds of speculation, and we'll see it even here as well. Maybe she's arguing that the house she lives in is not her father's house. In letter 65, Emily once said to her brother Austin, quote, "Father's real life and mine sometimes come into collision," end quote. And it may be that she's making a kind of a descriptor here of the house she lives in versus the house she lives in, if you get my drift. In other words, I'm stuck here, but I'm not stuck here because I dwell in possibility as an artist, as a poet. One scholar has called this Emily's description of her spiritual home, and another scholar has said, and I think this is compelling, quote, "Rarely, if ever, has there been so intense an affirmation of the ecstasy of poetic creation," end quote. Wow, I mean, with a scholar saying that about this poem, obviously let's spend a few minutes now reading and enjoying it. She says it this way: "I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof the gambrels of the sky, of visitors the fairest for occupation, this, the spreading wide my narrow hands, together paradise. Now, all of us who are artists or poets, or artists of any kind, we love the idea that this is what artists do. I mean, some artists say this is the best line to describe what creativity actually is, the spreading wide of narrow hands to gather paradise. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant way to say, this is what my life's work is, this is what my calling is. Notice she begins with the word, I dwell. She uses this word in 31 of her poems, and then she'll say, in possibility. Now, many, of course, have just read this as outright. Her possibility equals poetry here. I love when we get to 696, you can write this one down. When we get to poem 696, she'll call it acres of perhaps. And I love that, this possibility thing. Emily is the great poet of what could be, what might happen. I wonder if, that kind of thing, right? And it kind of seems to motivate much of her poetic venture. We saw possibility in 361, we saw it in 106 as well. Notice she'll say about this dwelling in possibility, poetry, a fairer house than prose. Now, I love this idea. She says, I live in a fairer house. Now, fairer here can mean any number of things. More beautiful, more well-constructed, more just. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think of it. Of course, prose will take us back to our reading of 6:13. They shut me up in prose. In other words, prose is everything other than poetry, right? And she says, I'm not interested in prose. And here's why. I have more windows. Now, of course, immediately the metaphor starts to become brilliant, right? The openness, if you will, of the expansiveness of her work. Superior, she says, fairer, superior, for doors. In other words, I have lots of doors. Now, Emily's room only had 2 doors. You can visit it in Amherst. But it's interesting that she says, no, I've got all kinds of doors. And of course, we think about that classic 20th century band named The Doors, Jim Morrison, who, by the way, was himself a poet, and who, of course, loved the poetry of Emily Dickinson, especially its radical nature. She says of chambers, notice we go to rooms now, of chambers as the cedars. By the way, let's remember that the last lines of Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, T.S. Eliot's classic, is lingered in chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown till humans' voices wake us and we drown. I actually think the genesis for much of Eliot's playing around with that language in Prufrock may come from this, very anthologized poem of chambers as the cedars. Now, of course, we got to point this out. Emily is a great reader of the King James Version of the Bible. And you'll remember in Psalm 104:16, the trees of the Lord are full of sap, the cedars of Lebanon, which he hath planted, end quote. But notice, in these trees, there is no mentioning for Emily of anything related to deity necessarily. Of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye is the closest thing to deity here. Of course, impregnable of eye is privacy. And we're reading a poem written by a woman who spent much of her life, if you want to call her a recluse you can, or agoraphobic you can, she's definitely withdrawn. It's almost a monastic enterprise, as we have said, for Emily. Impregnable of eye, let's also remember, she doesn't publish her stuff in her lifetime. She'll share it, but she doesn't publish it. Most people, before Emily's death, had never seen any of these poems that we're reading together. And for an everlasting roof, we'll finish with paradise, yes. The gambrels of the sky. In other words, roofs like the barn of Emily's growing up, where both sides are very steep, right? They slope on both sides. She's playing here with the idea of the sky as well. She once said, don't you think these brief, important meetings have a tale to tell whose sight is in the skies, end quote. Emily said that in a letter to one of her pals. In other words, I live beyond this earth. How could she possibly do that? Well, now we're back to Shelley's Ode to the West Wind and that final stanza. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. And now, Chats with Emily is the name of our playlist, yes? Of visitors. That's you, right? Who gets to come and visit this house of possibility, this poetic mansion? The fairest, she says. And her use of the word fairest here takes us back to, of course, to the second line, right? You've probably already drawn your circle back to it. The fairest, by the way, do you remember when we did 298? And she says, alone I cannot be, for hosts do visit me. Right, inspiration, the angels of inspiration, as we said in our study of that one. Of visitors, she says, oh, I have the fairest. For occupation, what do you do in this mansion that you've built? This, notice, for occupation, dash, this, capitalized, dash. This what? Oh no, let me tell you what my poetic project is. The spreading wide, my narrow hands. Notice again the paradox. The spreading wide, my narrow, the little. She's emphasizing, of course, the smallness of her hand. You'll remember from 652, narrow eyes. But notice the spreading wide of her narrow hands, not in prayer, at least not in any prayer that we would call a religious prayer, as much as what? To gather, to create, to make, to gather. Paradise. Of course, notice the off-rhyme of this and paradise. Quite brilliant. One scholar has called paradise here the plenitude of Eden. And here, of course, now we're back to John Milton. And what is his classic poem? Paradise what? Lost. But he wrote a second poem called what? Paradise Regained. And of course, Emily knows these poems well. It almost seems as if she's suggesting, no, in my house that I built, I reclaim Eden. I reclaim paradise. In fact, I construct paradise. Why? Because I can do it with poetry, and you'll never do it with prose. Well, I think at 2a, the message is here. One scholar has said, in possibility, one can spread one's narrow self into amplitude. It's a great way to say it. I'll read it again. It's such a beautiful quote. In possibility, i.e. poetry, one can spread one's narrow self into amplitude. You can expand yourself through the poetic venture. Prose has a tendency to limit, while poetry has a tendency to expand. That is to say, poetry for Emily is superior to prose. At 2b, I love the architecture symbolism here, right? Notice we go from windows to doors to roof, finally sky, i.e. paradise. At 3a, I can't help but read this and think of Shelley's defense of poetry, and of course the classic argument that poets are able to take what seems so obvious and make it brand new again. And again, our study of a little poem like Shelley's To a Skylark or Ode to the West Wind proves the point. I said that we would finish, however, with Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish writer, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish poet. He loved Emily Dickinson's work. He saw her as as kind of an important vital bridge between metaphysical inquiry and the physical world. His engagement with her work was both critical and creative. It spanned translations and as well inclusion in his major anthologies. He called her a messenger of reality. He included, actually, Emily in his famous anthology, A Book of Luminous Things. He placed her in a lineage of poets who render the, quote, he said it, realities of the world palpable, end quote. He admired how she captured the, what he called, epiphany of the moment while maintaining a fierce, almost surgical intellectual clarity. I would argue that she does this in this poem. He loved the metaphysical bond. He often paired her with other great poets of loss, in ecstasy. In his essay, The Hand of Art, Miłosz said that her line, after great pain, a form of feeling comes, is used to discuss how form and art communicate reality in the face of profound suffering. And then again, he was instrumental in translating Emily's work into Polish and helping to solidify her reputation in Eastern Europe. And then, of course, influences on his own work. Many scholars have often noted there are echoes of Dickinson's skepticism and the slant truth in Miłosz's later poetry, such as his poem, Meaning. It grapples with whether the world is a sign or just itself a core, obviously, Dickinsonian idea. In his treatise on poetry, and this is how we'll finish, in his treatise on poetry, which I very much recommend to you as young poets, in his preface, this is the classic poem that he begins that amazing treatise on. First, plain speech in the mother tongue. Hearing it, you should be able to see, as if in a flash of summer lightning, apple trees, a river, the bend of a road, and it should contain more than images. Sing-song lured it into being, melody, a daydream. Defenseless, it was bypassed by the dry, sharp world. You often ask yourself why you feel shame whenever you look through a book of poems. As if the author, for reasons unclear to you, addressed the worst side of your nature, pushing thought aside, cheating thought. Poetry, seasoned with satire, clowning, jokes, still knows how to please. Then its excellence is much admired, but serious combat, where life is at stake, is fraught in prose. It was not always so. And our regret has remained unconfessed. Novels and essays serve, but will not last. One clear stanza can take more weight than a whole wagon of elaborate prose. Now, he had to have been thinking of Emily Dickinson when he wrote a line like that. One good stanza can do more than whole volumes of novels or essays. Well, finally, to own a poem like this, two obvious questions. Do you dwell in possibility? Is that what your life is constructed around? What could be? And as an artist, is that where you draw your primary or chief inspiration from? Emily would certainly hope so. And then finally, what do you think of this argument that poetry is way superior to prose? We'll always take Homer's Iliad before we'll go to Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Thank you.